My name is Bruce Caldwell. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our first Hayek lecture of the year. The Hayek Lecture Series is supported by a grant from Thomas Smith Foundation, and it's sponsored on campus by two different organizations, the Center for the History of Political Economy, as well as the PPE program that is joint with Duke and UNC. This particular Hayek lecture is also sponsored by the ARET initiative of Duke's Keenan Institute for Ethics. Our speaker today is Professor David Skarbek. Professor Skarbek trained as an economist, but he spent his academic life as a political scientist. He got his PhD at George Mason University in 2010. He spent 2 years at Duke University as the Searle Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Science. And then he moved to King's College London and finally on to Brown University, where today he serves as an Associate Professor of Political Science. Professor Skarbek specializes in studying the emergence of social and governance orders in prisons. His work has been very well received. His first book, The Social Order of the Underworld, received Best Book of the Year awards from the American Political Science Association, as well as the wonderfully named International Association for the Study of Organized Crime. It was also shortlisted for the Thinking Aloud, A-L-L-O-W-E-D, Ethnography Award presented by the British Sociological Association and the BBC. His latest book, this book was just released, is The Puzzle of Prison Order, and it examines basically extending the work that he'd done earlier by examining the variety of types of prison life that one experiences around the world. That's the subject of his talk tonight. There'll be time after the talk for people to send questions in. If you have any questions for Professor Skarbek, you have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just send them in. I'll receive them. I will sort through them and pick out a subset to ask after Professor Skarbek finishes his talk. So it's my pleasure to present Professor David Skarbek.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, and to the centers for hosting me. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share with you a little bit of the research that I've been involved with in the last few years. This book, which, as you mentioned, has just come out, focuses on a primary research question, which is, why does prison social order vary around the world? It turns out, I argue, that prisons share several fundamental characteristics that are essentially either by practice or definition highly similar, regardless of where or when we look at prison. I think of it in sort of four ways. The first is that there's a selection effect, in that people are not randomly sent to prison. There are systematic factors that drive people to prison. There's also a selection bias, in that incarcerated people tend to come disproportionately from disadvantaged socioeconomic and minority communities. A third similarity that prisons share is that you don't usually get to choose who you interact with. You're forced to interact with your peers regardless of whether you choose to or not. Finally, prisons by definition are places that you can't voluntarily exit. Now, each one of those characteristics is true of prisons, again, by practice or definition. And these aren't just sort of insufficient or unimportant differences. These are actually some of the most important theoretical aspects that we think about when we're trying to determine whether social interactions are going to be negative, zero, or positive sum ones. So prisons share these fundamental characteristics, but as I argue in my book, the informal life in prison varies often in dramatic ways. In some prisons, prisoners have a high degree of solidarity. They work together effectively, and they exert pressure and influence and power both on other prisoners and on the prison officials themselves. By contrast, in some places, prisoners have very little solidarity. They don't engage in collective action, and their influence on the everyday life of the prison is minimal or non-existent. In the same way, when prisoners organize, they sometimes do so in highly decentralized ways, but in other cases, highly centralized ways. So for example, in some prisons, there's a very clearly defined social hierarchy, and each individual in that prison fits within that hierarchy in a very well-established place. In other places, there's not much of a social hierarchy. It's not very clear who's on top and who's on bottom in the terms of social esteem. Another difference in the degree of centralization is that in some prisons, the prisoners themselves elect their own leader, and these leaders often have an important influence on other prisoners and are often an important conduit when talking to prison officials. By contrast, in other places, there's no leader, there's no dominant individual in charge amongst the prisoners. In some prisons, they write very detailed and sophisticated written rules and regulations and even written constitutions that define the nature of their interactions amongst themselves as prisoners. In other places, order is established not through formal written rules, but through informal social norms, things like gossip, shaming, and ostracism. And so the goal of the book is to try to understand why these informal institutions vary so much, what explains these differences in outcomes. A key part of my argument is that we have to understand governance institutions to resolve this puzzle. Governance institutions define and enforce property rights, they facilitate exchange, and they aid in the production of collective and public goods. This is a picture taken from within a prison cell in California, and in it, we can see several sources of governance provided by prison officials. At the center of the screen is a correctional officer. It's his job, and it's his responsibility to maintain the safety and security of the people living in that housing unit. It's a source of govern amongst them. But the bars itself, the architecture can provide governance to some degree as well. The bars that keep another prisoner out of your cell protects you while at the same time keeping you in that cell. So the quality of official governance is an important part of this puzzle. I want to argue additionally that extra legal governance, governance outside of that which is provided by officials, matters as well. This is again another prison in California. It was a picture taken during a period of tremendous overcrowding. And so this is a dormitory that holds about 300 men. And within this room, within this housing area, there will only be somewhere between 3 and 4 prison officers, correctional officers, there to maintain the security of the facility. Now, when you look at this picture, you can see that people carrying out their daily activities, taking a nap, having a meal, playing cards with friends, you're exposed to other people's actions. And your property, to the extent that you have some, it may be kept in a box near your bunk bed, but other people may seek to take advantage of you. They may seek to steal your property when you're away. So I argue essentially on the margin that even when officials are present, and even if they do their jobs well, for many prisoners, it's often the case that they want to invest on the margin a little bit more time, energy, and resources to make themselves safer, to make their property safer. They have an incentive on the margin to provide this extra legal governance. Now, prisons in the United States have become dramatically safer since the 1970s, but large-scale disruptions and riots, like this video will soon show, still happen, are still a reality. Maybe more importantly, the threat that something like this can happen is a reality. So it makes sense for prisoners to spend time, energy, and resources to try to avoid outbreaks like that and to protect themselves should something like that arise. A second reason why prisoners produce extra legal governance is because of the underground economy. These are some of the thousands of mobile phones that prison officials in California confiscate from prisoners every single year. And every one of those phones is contraband. In addition to phones, many prisoners have a substantial demand for drugs, alcohol, tobacco, tattoo services, a wide range of goods and services that because of the regulations and restrictions in the prison system, they can't legally gain access to. So in order for prisoners to gain access to this contraband in the underground economy, there must be suppliers able to bring it into the prison, and there has to be rules to facilitate the exchange. Disputes are always going to arise in commercial transactions. How are these problems going to be resolved if you can't rely on officials? The way that I like to think about it is that the quality or the quantity of the heroin that a prison drug dealer delivers isn't what one expects. he or she can't turn to prison officials and ask them to adjudicate and resolve that problem peacefully. So prisoners have to invest in extra-legal governance institutions to allow and support the extra-legal underground economy. So this research is in many ways in the tradition of a Robert Ellickson or a Barack Richmond, in that it's trying to understand the operation and effectiveness of private ordering institutions, to study markets and exchange in the shadow of the law and the robustness and viability of order without law. So I break my analysis down into two separate questions. The first is simply to ask, why is prisoners' extra-legal governance institutions more important, more influential, more active in some places than in others? And my argument is a fairly simple one. If prison officials provide high-quality governance, if they provide competent administration of the facility, and if they provide ample or sufficient resources, prisoners have very little reasons themselves to invest time, energy, and resources to replicate those efforts. By contrast, if prison officials don't provide resources, they provide ineffective administration and low-quality governance institutions, then there's now a gap, there's a need that prisoners still have, which in some, not all, but many cases, prisoners then invest their own time and energy to produce the governance that officials are not providing. In order to make this argument, I look at two extreme cases, and I'll discuss today a Bolivian prison where prison officials are essentially absent and provide close to no governance or resources. And I'll look at Nordic prisons where the state and prison officials provide a substantial amount of high quality governance. The second question is about when prisoners organize, why is it more or less centralized? And my main argument here is that if prisoners can rely on decentralized mechanisms, things like gossip, shaming, and ostracism, then they'll tend to rely on those things. These decentralized enforcement mechanisms are actually very convenient. It doesn't require a lot of collective action. It doesn't require coordination amongst many different prisoners. And it doesn't require a lot of physical resources to impose or to implement. So if decentralized mechanisms like gossip and shaming work, prisoners will use those. However, those mechanisms don't always work. In large prison populations, for example, in prisons where people don't know most other people's reputations, these mechanisms are much less painful and therefore much less effective. If an individual is ostracized by one group of people, he might be able to easily turn and interact and socialize with others. So in cases like this, where decentralized mechanisms fail, prisoners have an incentive to invest in producing more centralized institutions in order to provide that extra legal governance. To test this hypothesis in the book, I look at a series of comparative case studies. So I look at the history of the California prison system from the 1950s to the recent era. I compare men's and women's prisons in California, and I compare men's prisons in California and England to substantiate and advance this argument. In addition to a theoretical and empirical exercise, the goal of this book is also partly a methodological one. It takes as the observation that the vast majority of studies of prison social order are single site studies, or in a few cases, several sites within the same prison system. And while these are incredibly important studies already, nevertheless, I feel there's a tremendous amount of value in that I believe and argue that we can use these individual studies as data in a broader comparative analysis. And making the comparative analysis in the forefront allows us to better understand the nature of mass incarceration relative to other countries and the role and effects of carceral states around the world. So I use these data in a comparative analysis. And in the book, I'm only going to speak about several of the cases today. I look at 15 core case studies. These are supplemented by many dozens of shadow cases, as well as my own original historical research. Now, a problem with doing this sort of analysis is the concern that I might cherry pick cases such that they support the claims and arguments that I make. So I follow the research methods practice in selecting cases based on variation in the explanatory variables in my theory. So in the book, I discuss 3 prisons where the quality of official governance is very low. and I looked at 2 cases where the quality of governance is very high. And then having selected on those, I examined what the social order looks like in those facilities. Likewise, I select cases based on variation in the size and diversity in social networks of the prison. So in the history of California, prisons there used to be small and homogeneous, and over time became very large and very diverse. Women's prisons in California today and in the past are defined by very small prison populations. English prisons, which I'll discuss shortly, have a combination of both small prison populations, but also dense pre-prison social networks that make things like shaming and gossip even more powerful. And then finally in the book, I discuss a unique and controversial housing unit in the Los Angeles County Jail. And this is an interesting population in part because it combines 3 characteristics. The people there, there's very few of them. They have dense pre-prison social networks, and they share many cultural and worldview aspects. That means that they're very quite similar in their interactions and in their non-incarcerated lives. So I'm not going to discuss all those, but I want to sort of just give some context. I'm going to sort of discuss at a low level, but those cases are the sort of deep foundation on which the argument that I make today is based. So to begin, I want to discuss how the quality of official governance varies and what are its consequences. In Latin America, in general, their prisons are in a very poor condition. Their prisons typically are incredibly overcrowded, sometimes 3 to 5 times, sometimes even more, the design capacity of the facility. There's often far too few correctional officers maintaining order and stability in those prisons. There are often many hundreds and even thousands of prisoners per correctional officer in these facilities. These are places of desperate poverty. They're often very unclean and dirty environments. And most Latin American prisoners lack access to sort of reasonable levels of healthcare and mental care. And then finally, the architecture in which many Latin American prisoners live are in substantial disrepair. And this can lead to dangerous conditions such as open wiring being dangerously close to open water faucets. So the quality of official governance is quite low in Latin American prisons. At the same time, we see across Latin America a proliferation of extra-legal prisoner governance institutions. So on the screen, you can see just a sample of the many different sort of informal extra-legal sources of governance that prisoners themselves produce. And they come by many different names. In Peru, there are delegates. In Guatemala, there are committees of order and discipline. In Mexico, there are cell block bosses. Colombia, internal chiefs. These are a wildly diverse set of informal institutions. Some are effective, some are ineffective, some are very effective at improving the quality of life for prisoners. Others are more predatory. Some of them are extortionist. But the key, the important aspect here is that what prisoners produce in terms of extralegal governance is widespread and it's a dominant influence. It's not extraordinary in Latin American prisons. Now, I want to sort of dig down into a particular case so we can get some texture and some understanding about how these particular institutions operate in practice. What does this actually mean, extralegal governance in a prison? One of the cases I discuss in my book is San Pedro Prison. And from the outside of the prison, it looks, well, a lot like any Western prison, right? There are tall, foreboding walls. There are prison staff maintaining the security of the perimeter. But beyond that, this prison operates very much unlike any prison that exists in the United States and much of the Western world. There are no guards within the prison. They don't have a presence there, and they don't maintain order within the prison. Instead, the National Lawyers Guild explains the prison administration provides no rehabilitation services, no schools, and minimal health care. They report that prisoners have complete freedom of movement within the prison. Prison officials provide access to electricity and water, which prisoners have to pay a fee for before being released. And the prison officials also provide this food, which prisoners describe as a gruel-like substance. According to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the food is not properly prepared, which might lead in many cases to epidemics and infections. And the food is also insufficient, obliging many prisoners to pay for their own food if they have the money to do so. This is a picture of the prison from above. And if you look closely, you can see that there are 7 or 8 different housing units within the total footprint of the prison. And within these different housing units, it is again unique from sort of what our Western conventions about prisons are, is that prison officials do not give prisoners a cell. Prisoners do not have the right to a cell. In order to have a cell, prisoners either have to rent or pay for a cell. And across these housing sections, the quality varies tremendously. Typically, prisoners will purchase a home from another prisoner when they arrive. Prisoners are allowed to modify, even to build up additional structures on top of prisons. They can buy adjoining prison cells and knock down the door to have more space. And prisoners typically sell these homes before they're released from the prison. Within each housing section within the prison, there are democratically elected committees in charge of a variety of functions. This includes resolving disputes, organizing educational activities, entertainment activities, and recreational activities. Again, all representatives are elected and are residents of that housing section. According to the National Lawyers Guild, each section has the feel of a neighborhood or even a small village with its own courtyard, plaza, and shops. The committee in charge of each section manages it, repairs the sidewalks, or paints the walls. Each directiva sets an assessment charge for prisoners in the section, and each committee is responsible for its own budgets. Inmates pay for all services. So we see within this particular prison that when prison officials do not provide, prisoners are not sort of forced to passively accept their situation. They respond, they organize, and they sometimes do so democratically. In addition to that, because of the absence of prison regulations, there's actually a sort of flourishing market economy within the facility. For a small fee, people from outside of the prison can enter the facility and visit prisoners. And in doing so, they often bring in economic resources and supplies. On the screen is a picture of a little food stand that one of the prisoners operates. One observer of the prison notes that the prison economy contains cooks, painters, restaurateurs, carpenters, electricians, cleaners, accountants, and doctors. There were artisans who sold their artwork in tiny handicrafts, such as paintings and figurines. And they do that for many of the same reasons that we all go to our respective jobs, to earn money to spend. One prisoner explains, not everyone likes the food in the canteen, so we sell snacks and sandwiches here for inmates and for their families when they come to visit. The money I make, I pay my rent and keep a few Bolivianos for cigarettes. This prison is also unique relative to Western prisons, but not unique relative to Latin American prisons, in that many prisoners have children and spouses come live with them during their period of confinement. In Bolivia, legally, children up to the age of 8 are allowed to reside with an incarcerated parent. In practice, that age threshold has never been enforced. And so there are children of all ages who live within the prison. Depending on the time of year and the estimate, somewhere between 200 and 400 children reside within the prison. They typically leave during the morning, attend schools on the outside, and return in the afternoon or early evening to spend time with their family. Now, in response to this very sensitive population that lives within the prison, prisoners have, again, created institutions in response to that need. So there's a San Pedro Parents Association. It's made up of parents of children in the prison. They organize educational and recreational activities, and they create rules that bind their own members, but that also create an obligation for other prisoners. And several prisoners told me that one of the most important rules that the Parents Association creates is that you're not allowed to fight in the presence of children. And they report that not only is this rule sort of widely known, but it's also widely followed. So within this Bolivian prison, we see a flourishing of diverse and fairly effective extra-legal governance institutions. There are democratically elected committees running housing sections. There's a sort of civil society in the form of parents associations. There's also religious groups and others. And there's a sort of economic aspect where the opportunity to gain access to economic resources from the outside has mitigated to some extent the sort of poverty imposed by these people by the state and prison officials. And these institutions, they create incentives that on the margin, I think, improve life for people living in this community. The ability to modify your own cell means that you can invest in ways to make yourself safer. You can add an additional lock to the door. And of course, you're the one with the lock and key, not a correctional officer. To the extent that you're a residual claimant to a cell within a housing unit, you may have some incentive to try to improve the rules governing that housing committee so that your property is more desirable and more profitable when you sell it at some point in the future. And then finally, the ability to get more through trade increases the opportunities to benefit yourself without directly disadvantaging someone else through theft or victimization. So when prison officials provide little and low quality governance, prisoners often respond in effective ways that benefits themselves and their community. For sort of sharp contrast, move to a different region of the world. Let's think through prison systems in places like Norway and the Nordic systems more generally. Very different levels of official governance provided. These prisons are very small. Most prisons don't hold 100 prisoners in Nordic countries. There is no overcrowding whatsoever, and it's often less than the design capacity of a facility. There's as many prison staff as prisoners across the Nordic prison systems. And unlike the Latin American case, they're very well trained, extensively so. They're compensated well, and working in prisons is esteemed in the community, much like we might esteem a sort of public school teacher. It's sort of a mark of pride that you work in a prison and help people who are currently incarcerated. Then finally, the resources available to Nordic prisons is vastly greater than it is for Latin American prisons. They are very well fed. They have extensive educational and vocational training opportunities and a wide range of entertainment and recreation activities to keep them busy. So prison officials here provide lots of resources, highly effective administration, and high quality governance to prisoners. This is a picture of a cell in a maximum security prison. And we can see on the right that there's a little bed. There's an intercom next to it to communicate with correctional staff. There's a little writing desk with a large sun-filled window. And there's also a TV tucked away on the other side of the wall. Again, this is for a maximum security prison. This is a communal area where prisoners can socialize and interact with each other. A little bit of furniture, a large flat screen TV. In many prisons, prisoners have access to their own kitchen with the full suite of cooking utensils, including knives, to prepare their own food. This is again at the maximum security prison, sort of gym and a place where prisoners can spend time and exercise and engage in a variety of different sports and games. So what is the informal life in prisons like these like? They don't invest in extensive and important extra-legal institutions like prisoners in San Pedro prison do, because they don't need to. There are important social norms that govern interactions between prisoners in these facilities. They ostracize prisoners primarily, and they do so for a few common reasons. They often ostracize prisoners who have a substance use disorder that they are not managing well. They ostracize prisoners who are sex offenders, and they ostracize prisoners who are sort of unpredictable or complain excessively. Prisoners in these Nordic prisons have little incentive to invest in extra legal governance because it would only be replicating that which officials are already doing. They don't need markets because prisons provide them resources. They don't need to create extensive governance mechanisms because the state actually governs fairly well. The second part of my argument is in examining why prisoners are highly organized and centralized in some places and very decentralized in others. So I want to start with the case of California. In California today, prison gangs are a dominant force in the everyday life of prisoners. Prison gangs are organizations whose membership is mutually exclusive. You can only be in one gang, you can't be in multiple gangs. Membership is restrictive. You have to earn your way into a gang. Not everyone is allowed. And they're permanent. Prisoners swear a lifetime oath and membership requirement to a gang when they join. As you can tell from this individual, a former gang member, they also often have pretty elaborate tattoos. And these tattoos communicate a tremendous amount of information to people who are living and working in California's prisons. The large black hand tattoo on this individual's chest with the M in the middle is a clear indication that he's affiliated with the Mexican Mafia prison gang, for example. These groups are overwhelmingly racially and ethnically segregated, as this individual's tattoo across his forehead attests. These prison gangs have a tremendous influence on the everyday affairs of prisoners and prison staff in California. But in conducting research in this area, I was surprised to learn that these gangs have not always existed. It's not that prisons exist, so they must have gangs. In California, the prison system there operated for more than 100 years, and no groups like those prison gangs I just described existed within their facilities. Instead, starting in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, we see the initial emergence of some of the now most notorious prison gangs, the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family. And from the 1970s to the present, these gangs have grown in number, their membership has grown, and their influence has grown to a considerable degree. So if gangs are so important today, why didn't they exist for more than 100 years? I'm going to argue that this is really best understood as a question of why do prisoners use decentralized institutions prior to the 1960s, and why do they use centralized institutions thereafter? Prior to the emergence and dominance of gangs, prisoners relied on an informal system of social norms that they often referred to as the code or the convict code. And it was a fairly simple and straightforward set of norms. Don't inform on other people, don't be nosy, don't gossip too much, don't lie and steal, pay your debts back, don't whine. To the extent that an individual adhered to this, he would stand high in the social hierarchy. He would have the support of his peers, and he'd be less likely to be victimized. If someone violated these norms on a regular basis, he wouldn't have support of peers, he wouldn't have mutual assistance, so that individual would be more likely to be violated, to be shunned and ostracized, and possibly victimized. So it was a very decentralized system in that nobody sat down and created what the rules are and disseminated them to other people. There was no structure, monitoring for violations of the norms. By contrast, individuals could either choose to follow the norms or not, and they could choose to enforce violations of the norms or not. Today, the governance is far more centralized, and it's centered around gangs in what I refer to as a community responsibility system. In a community responsibility system, all members of some area must affiliate with a particular group. Gangs are one of the most important such groups in the California context. And within a group, all members of that group are responsible for each individual person's actions, debts, and obligations. So for example, if an individual in the group on the left incurs a drug debt to a drug dealer in the group on the right, not only is he responsible for repaying it, but everyone in his gang is responsible for that debt. Now, in practical terms, if that individual couldn't pay it back, his gang might force him to contact friends and family for the money. They might pool their resources to pay the debt. They might do work. The individual might have to do some task or job for the other gang, maybe assault a correctional officer who they don't like. What's become increasingly common is that the gang on the left will assault their own member to the severity that it sends a clear signal to the other gang's leaders that we took this seriously and we're imposing a cost on ourselves. So in this way, groups exert tremendous in-group pressure to ease social and economic conflict across groups. These gangs have leaders, they're often called shot callers, and they're often involved in negotiations about how problems like this will be resolved. One prisoner explains how this operated in practice. He says, "It was my responsibility on the yard to ensure that our people were not harmed by another race. I took care of the drug debts. One of our people became delinquent in a drug debt to another race. It was my responsibility to either cover their drug debt or to have them stabbed, in which case we would send one of ours to stab him." So this is an alarming and a difficult social structure that works, and the way in which he describes it clarifies or very well describes how a community responsibility system operates. Gangs have extensive written rules that they write and disseminate to new prisoners. New prisoners are sort of tested on their knowledge of the rules and their obligations. Gangs keep lists of people who have violated the rules, and when these people return to prison, they're often assaulted and sometimes killed. As the warden at the time at San Quentin Prison explains, the Department of Corrections has pretty much given over control of the general population to gangs. Why do they do this? They do this because that reputation-based governance era, when prisoners could rely on the convict code, it started to falter and violence responded, so they turned to alternatives for a solution. They did this because the size of the prison population exploded. So this is the size of the total prison population in California from its start in 1851 through about 1921. Always fewer than about 4,000 prisoners. There's growth, but it's relatively stable. Then between 1920 and 1970, we see about a five-fold increase in the size of the prison population. Unprecedented heights driven by more rapid growth than in earlier periods. During this period, when there's a strong increase in the prison population, this is also coincides with when we see prison gangs form. And if you go and look at the historical and archival evidence, prisoners at this time are continually expressing the fact that the prison is feeling less stable, it's more violent. Prison officials are recognizing that there's an increase in stabbings, there's more riots, signs of disorder. The social order that existed before is breaking down. This is data that from the same slide, which because of mass incarceration today is completely blown out of the water. So the prison population today regularly holds more than 120,000 prisoners. And in doing so, it eliminates the ability for things like gossip, shame, and ostracism to be very effective. So gangs turn then, they pivot to more centralized institutions like gangs to try to restore some stability and to meet the governance needs that they have. So the mutual responsibility system is actually very well designed to providing governance in large communities of strangers. It's a lot easier to know the reputation of a group than it is to know the reputation of every person in a group, for instance. And the characteristics of membership make it so that it's less easy for one prisoner to free ride on the efforts and resources of other members of the group. That's partly why they're restrictive, so that gangs can exclude people that they think will be irresponsible. Gang membership is mutually exclusive, and it is permanent, so that there is less ambiguity about which group is responsible for a particular person in a particular time. And part of the reason that why they're racially and ethnically segregated is to lower the cost in the community more generally to know with which group an individual affiliates. In addition to prominent tattoos on the face, neck, and hands, race is a shorthand to know who to complain to if somebody who you don't know has disrespected or victimized you in some way. So we shouldn't expect to see those things in places where prisoners can rely on more decentralized governance efforts. Gangs don't provide governance out of good intentions. They provide it because peaceful, stable prisons are profitable ones. One prisoner explains, we don't fight in a riot unless we have to. If I'm locked down, then I'm not working. You can make some serious bank in prison, and shop callers hate it when you're in lockdown. I'm going to skip, for the sake of time, the case of English prisons and women's prisons, but if you'd like to, please ask me in the Q&A. I can tell you a bit more about the social orders there. So the purpose of this book is to develop a theory and test it to try to understand the tremendous diversity of institutional outcomes in prisons around the world and through time. It's methodological in arguing that we should use individual site studies as data in a broader comparative analysis. And while I think the book provides insights into the nature of American mass incarceration and carceral state, I think it also has lessons for broader interests, for people interested in the study of institutions, and for the study in particular of self-enforcing exchange institutions, this literature that focuses on private ordering. So I think the study of prison provides some insights into how effective self-enforcing exchange rather than exchange based on state-based contracts can work. I think there's a few lessons. The first is that many of the most interesting and important early studies in this literature focused on groups like the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New York that engaged in high-value diamond trades but use no written state-based contracts. People like Lisa Bernstein and Barak Richmond have written important work on this. And it's fascinating in part because it shows that if the community conditions are right, you don't need the state to support the trade that you wish to engage in. But I always thought that there are ways in which this example illuminates but also obscures. And I think it obscures in the sense that in many of these studies, the people who are cooperating without the state have incredible wealth, they have extensive education, they have deep communities of social capital that they're able to leverage to promote cooperation. Study in prisons provides us a unique alternative look. Prisoners don't have wealth, they don't have extensive education, they can't rely on a rich community of religious and social capital to promote cooperation. They lack all of those things. And so what this book shows is that in many cases, even though they're at a disadvantage, prisoners can often, not always, but often facilitate self-governance and self-exchange, even though they're not the sort of most likely to cooperate community relative to past studies. The second is that there's a big debate in this sort of private ordering literature about how much the state has a shadow that allows it to work well. Abner Greif has written brilliant articles and books on medieval trade, and he argues that that trade took place by relying on coalitions and reputations instead of states and contracts. And a strong counter argument motivated by sort of deep historical knowledge has argued that the cooperation that Greif observes only exists because the traders know that if they can't resolve a problem, they can fall back on and turn to state-based legal institutions. The study of prison provides an opportunity to shut that down. If prisoners engage in illicit drug trade and contraband, if they do deals with meth and heroin and tobacco, all that's forbidden in prison, if that negotiation, if some problem isn't resolved, they can't turn to officials to do it. Nevertheless, they're often very successful, and the volume of trade in the underground economy is one indication of its success. Robert Ellison has probably written the most important book on private ordering. He looks at the ability for gossip and small acts of violence to promote neighborly values that are actually inconsistent with legal rules in Shasta County in California. And he argues that that self-enforcing exchange, that self-governance works because the community is small and very tight-knit, meaning that reputation matters a lot. In my book, I look at a variety of ways in which people in large and loose-fit societies, maybe they can't rely on the same mechanisms that Ellison identifies, but there are a variety of alternatives that allow them to scale up the scope and the amount of activity, the number of people who are being governed. So the book shows that these self-enforcing exchange mechanisms can be more robust than past research suggests. And then finally, I hope that the book will make an argument that there's really a substantial need for fine-grained and rich engagement with qualitative evidence and research methods. The details, the thick description that ethnographers identify is crucial to understanding not only what's operating within these prisons, but that the intuitions that's baked into our theories of social order are actually manifesting in practice. So as a strong proponent and fan of causal inference and the sort of plethora of quantitative methods that are in operation today, I want to sort of argue that we should embrace all of those, but there's gains from trade from maintaining some of the more traditional qualitative and ethnographic research methods that we've often relied on to study prisons. So with that, I'll stop, and I would be delighted if anyone has questions or discussion.
Well, thank you for that fascinating discussion, David. We do have a few questions for you. The first one was from someone who really was taken by your discussion of the Bolivian prisons and wondered how that institution of a market initially got started. Do you have any sense of the history of that?
Unfortunately, the history, the origin story of many of these institutions are sort of lost to time. There's not a lot of record taking and record making in these environments for obvious reasons, but they do seem to emerge. And we see this actually across a wide range of studies. One of the earliest studies of prison social order was actually an ethnography by an economist named Radford, who was incarcerated in a World War II prisoner of war camp. And he discusses how the emergence of markets come about, how money and the source of barter leading into money emerges in the prison system. And my sense is that that's not atypical, that these opportunities to benefit yourself and benefit someone else, prisoners are actively looking for those opportunities. They have a strong incentive to find them, right? It allows them to improve their lives. And when resources are available from the outside, these are very entrepreneurial, very thoughtful, intelligent, strategic actors. So they find spot market opportunities, and surely some of them fail, but a lot of them, based on the evidence that we see, is working and is working well.
Right, fascinating. A second question, your diagram about the explosion of the prison populations, it looked like somewhere maybe in the Great Depression, prison populations started to go up, and then it stabilized for a while, and then there was a big jump, it looked like, in the 1980s. Can you explain what was going on to cause the prison population to go up so quickly? That was the one on California, I guess.
The prison population is influenced by many different things. The bump that you see in that earlier era is simply mostly the result of an increase in the population more generally in California. So if the state is going to incarcerate a certain percentage of people and there's more people who live there, more are going to end up in the prison system. That explains a lot of it. In fact, the rate per 100,000 people, the incarceration rate until the 1980s, is very stable for as long as data is available. What we see in the 1980s is mass incarceration, the start of it, which is driven by a variety of different factors. Prosecutors were more likely to charge someone who was arrested with the felony, which meant that more people were going to prison and for longer. More laws were passed, more tough on crime laws, meaning longer sentences were passed. There was more crime as well, which influences that. So there's a big debate historically about why all those factors come together in the 1980s. So I would recommend someone like Elizabeth Hinton has a very important book on From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime that looks at how a variety of sort of either political mistakes or political strategies, political opportunism have sort of mixed together to lead to this culmination in the 1980s when we're prosecuting the war on drugs and a variety of other fronts. That's led to that spike, and that's why the United States incarcerates, about 24% of the world's prison population, with only about 4% of the world's population.
You said that you skipped over the women's prison experience, and so one of the questioners wanted to have you expand on that a little bit, please.
So women in California prisons don't form gangs. Their social order looks much more like the informal convict code that existed in men's prisons prior to the formation of gangs. Individual reputations matter a lot. Prisoners sometimes form what they call play families, or sort of pseudo families. So one prisoner will take on the role of mom, another will take on the role of dad. They might adopt kids. But these aren't gangs in that they're not permanent. People get married and divorced, they adopt kids and disavow them. They're not mutually exclusive in that one person's sisters or brothers are somebody else's aunts and uncles and cousins. And women find protection within these groups. They find companionship. They gain access to more resources. But it's primarily still sort of a decentralized form of social order. They're also not racially segregated. And the reason for this difference today in men's and women's prisons is that women's prisons populations have never gotten as large as men's populations were when they had to turn to gangs because decentralized mechanisms failed to work. The height of incarceration of women in California, I think, was something a little less than 15,000 women in total. That number is much smaller today. So the prison population amongst women has never gotten big enough that they needed to stop relying on things like shame, gossip, and ostracism.
Okay, here's a kind of a general question. How did you get involved in this research? Did you go on site when you were undertaking it? Were you taking those pictures yourself? And were you ever scared out of your wits by what you were encountering? Some of those quotes that you shared were pretty frightening, I must say. So tell us a little bit about your experience in doing this research.
Yeah, I've conducted field work in minimum, medium, and maximum security prisons in California, North Carolina, and I've worked with the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom. But this book is primarily not, an ethnography based on my field work. This is making this methodological argument that individual ethnographers should be in conversation with each other because we can learn from other sites. Famous political scientist says that if you only know one country, then you know no countries. We must have comparison in order to understand what's special and unique and what's simple and universal within a particular site. So this is my sort of exercise in the sort of imagination about a comparative study of prison social order. In the prisons that I've been to and the many prisons and formerly incarcerated people who I've spoken with, I've never felt unsafe, and the sort of rate of people who have been harmed while doing academic research is incredibly low, and some people have said that there's actually no documented instances of someone being harmed. And I think that's because in most cases, legitimate academics pursuing these questions are not a threat or harm to prisoners, maybe quite the opposite. They're providing attention, sometimes resources. They're providing a sympathetic ear. They're interested in what's going on in these people's lives in a way that in many prisons, prison staff are sort of less interested or less active in sort of mentoring and caring about what somebody has to say about their situation.
Right. Well, David, this has been a fascinating talk. We want to thank you again for being our Hayek lecturer, and hope you get back to prison soon, real soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.